What's up, guys? It's Hunter Sitchy from CheckShovPoker.com, and the title of today's video is Average Saturday Night. So, like I said in my previous video, Average Friday Night, I had an interesting weekend last weekend, and I just want to share some of the interesting hands that I played. So, without further explanation, let's just jump into some of these hand histories. Alright, so in this first hand, I'm sitting in a 5-10 game, and it folds around to middle position who limps. Middle position is a very loose passive player that's in a lot of 5-10 games in South Florida. I'm in the hijack and I look down at King Jack suited and I isolate to 50. So now why am I isolating to that size instead of isolating to 4x, which would be considered standard by most people? It's honestly just because the game that we play uses primarily green chips, and I think a fish is more likely to call a raise of 2 chips as opposed to a smaller, more normalized raise like $40 and having to call using 4 chips. So that's kind of why I do that. Folds around to MP, who of course calls, and the flop comes King 7 Deuce Rainbow. He leads out for 50. Now this is a mistake that a lot of fishy players make. They like to lead out with weak top pairs and weak middle pairs and try and end the hand early or get to showdown cheaply, and that's kind of a cop-out because it basically turns his hand face up. I do not have to tell the truth to him in position. So if I had a hand like ace 10 here, I would probably raise and blast him off his hand. He's not looking to continue with whatever he's leading into me with in this situation. So when I have king jack, I choose to just call instead of raising for thin value, and it's because I don't want to turn my hand into a bluff against a player that isn't looking to play a big pot. So the turn is the jack of clubs and he leads out again. And if the turn hadn't made 2 pair for me, I think I would have just called and allowed him to make a smaller mistake more consistently on the river, like betting 100 with a 7 in his hand, or a hand like king 4. In this situation, I would much rather try and play for stacks by raising bigger and causing him to make a much bigger mistake a smaller percentage of the time. So I end up raising to 250 here, and I think this is the best play. It really just comes down to a simple formula. So it's the percentage of the time that he's going to make a mistake times the size of the mistake that he's going to make. So if he's going to stack off to me here 1 in 10 times and lose 1,400, that's more profitable than him making a $100 bet on the river that I always call and he's always behind 10 out of 10 times. So that's kind of how that ends up working. Luckily, he calls in this situation, and the river is the 8 of hearts. This is a card that doesn't improve any part of his range to beat me. So I think that he would fold a hand like 8s on the turn, but probably call with a hand like 8-7 because he has a few more outs to 2 pair. And at the same time, I don't really think he has a hand like 10-9 in his range. And of course, he doesn't have 7s or deuces, kings, or jacks. I block a lot of those combinations, and I also think he would have played them differently. So I'm basically always ahead on this river. And the other great thing about this river is that it improves some of his hands to 2 pair. So he can have king 8 in his range, or jack 8, or 8-7. And if he had a much stronger preflop holding, such as ace king or king queen here, I also think that there's a decent chance that he would call a shove on this river just because he perceives me to be a very aggressive player. So he checks, I ship and go for kind of an unorthodox bet sizing, and he ends up snap calling with a worse 2 pair, and I scoop a much bigger pot than most people would win here, and it's really just because I was more aware of Villain's limp calling range here. Okay, so in this second hand, it folds all the way around to the small blind, who doesn't want to chop. He's a local MTT pro. He thinks he's pretty good. He raises to 50. Now, the first thing that you should know is that 99% of MTT players are terrible deep stack players. They're just god awful, and there's no way that they could really ever win in a tough 5-10 game. And this is just a perfect example of that. He should never be raising to 50. He knows that I'm just going to punish him when stacks are deep, and he still does this. So as you've seen in other videos, 8-6 is like an auto 3-bet for me when stacks are deep in this situation, because there's nothing that he can really do that benefits him in this situation more than me. He can't 4-bet to 425 because stacks are so deep. I'm going to peel him and flop a combo draw 12% of the time. I'm going to pair up a third of the time. And the rest of the time, I'm going to float him and probably punish him on the turn. He can call in and try and play a pot against me out of position. Again, I'm going to flop plenty of draws, and I'm going to be able to interpret his depolarized range here. Or he can fold and give me $50. None of those options are good for him here, and he still wants to continue with the hand. He calls. Flop comes king 10-4 with 2 clubs. He checks. I bet 225. Totally standard here. This is obviously one of the boards that I'm going to continue on, and he ends up folding. Now, why did I show you this hand here? It's a pretty simple hand history, but one thing that I wanted to point out was this flop texture here. So on a flop like this, you actually don't want the board to get more coordinated. So normally an ace is beneficial to your range, but in this situation, you don't want an ace, a queen, a jack, or a 9 to come off. If a card was going to come off that doesn't make a flush for you, you'd prefer it to be either a 5, a 7, or a blank. And that's really just because it doesn't improve any part of his range. So you might be able to get him to fold a 10 or even a weak king by the river by betting 3 streets. But I consistently see a lot of players c-bet the flop here. They're trying to experiment with a loose aggressive style, and then a blank comes off and they assume that they don't have enough fold equity and they check it back. I actually think that's a mistake. A blank on this board is actually very beneficial to you, and you need to continue to represent a hand like ace-king in this spot. So third hand, here's another very common mistake that you'll see a lot of even 5-10 players make. So cutoff opens, 30 standard, button calls, and I'm in the small blind with king 9 suited here. And I see about 90% of players try and call here and play a pot out of position. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, you're giving the big blind free equity, so he can peel with pretty much anything when he's getting the odds that he's getting. And then you're also not giving cutoff or button an opportunity to make a folding mistake. And then that's before you even consider the playability of your hand. So you're out of position. If you flop a king, you have to worry about kicker issues. If you flop a 9, you have to worry about overpairs. If you flop a draw, it's going to be harder to play because you might not always be able to check raise with it, and leading out might look strange. Overall, I don't really think that king 9 plays very well out of position as a call here, and I think if you're going to play it, you should be 3-betting. I think calling here is just a huge leak. So in this situation, I think cutoff and button are just folding way too often, especially when stacks are this deep. I go ahead and 3-bet to 175, big blind folds, cutoff folds, and button calls. Now, before we go to the flop, why did I use this size? I think that in live poker in general, you should just be using slightly larger sizes pre-flop. So when you open, you're not opening to 2.5x, you're opening to 3.5x, and it's because people call you a little bit too wide, and you'd like to follow up with aggression post-flop and punish them for that. So there's just more money to play with when they're folding too often. At some point during the hand, you just have to figure out which street it is. And the same goes for 3-betting. So if he's going to call, I'd like to make a bigger pot, and then I'm very, very good at figuring out which street he's folding too often on, and then I just punish people for that. So that's kind of why I use a slightly bigger size. Now, if you're playing online, use normal sizes because people are much, much better. They understand ranges so much more than live poker players do. But anyway, he ends up calling, and we go to a flop of king 9-4 with 2 clubs here. Now, this is a very, very special flop here. It doesn't look that special, but it really is. So the biggest thing that you need to be aware of is that I flopped a backdoor flush shot. The second thing is that I have a middle pair here, but it's very vulnerable. So I decided to do something that's a little bit unorthodox. I think FTT players are a little bit more aware of what I'm doing here, but overall cash game players pretty much never do this. They usually bet either like 3/4 pot, or they try and play a check guess game. I do something a little bit strange, and I lead out for less than 1/3 pot, and button ends up folding. But let me tell you what this bet accomplishes here. So if he has complete air here, like let's say he has a hand like Queen Jack or Jack 10 or King Jack even, all of those hands have outs against me, and by checking, even if he just checks back, I give him free equity, okay? At the same time, if I check too often with a hand like a 9 or kings through, let's say, 10s here, I'm exposing my range quite a bit, especially if I don't check aces enough of the time. So if I don't check ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack here a decent amount of the time, I'm really exposing a lot of my range, and he can get me to fold a bunch of that by the river if he just starts the hand by betting the flop, okay? So I can avoid all of that and buy up a lot of his equity by betting 125. But then another great thing is that if a spade comes off, I can turn my hand into a bluff here and potentially get him to fold. Even a weak ace like ace 10, I could get him to fold by the river just by turning a 9 into a bluff here when I pick up a bunch of equity. And the times that I do backdoor spades, it's only going to happen about 4.5% of the time. I'm taking his whole stack here. He's just not going to give me credit for that. And then lastly, if I hit a king or a 9, I can turn that into huge value here and really just punish him because it's something that he should really never expect for me to have in my range. He shouldn't really expect me to have a 9 that I'm betting with on this flop. So all of that is very beneficial to me, and overall betting 125 makes this flop really easy to play without making me exploitable. Okay, hand number 4. This happened a couple rounds later. It folds around to small blind. He's the same MTT player that doesn't know what he's doing when stacks are deep as the other hand. He found out 50 doesn't work against me, so he tried 30. I looked down at queen nine of clubs, and that's basically just a big suited double gapper that plays a little bit better when you're the aggressor in position than it does as a flat. So I go ahead and 3-bet it to 125, and small blind ends up calling. Flop comes queen 10-4 with 2 diamonds. He checks to me, and this is a situation where I see a lot of guys check back with weak top pairs, and there's nothing really wrong with that on rainbow boards. But on this board, since it's so coordinated, I think betting here to get value from a hand like queen 8 or queen 7 suited, or a 10 or jack 9, king jack diamonds, or even a float like ace king or ace jack is way better than checking back and trying to induce a bluff from this guy. So I go ahead and bet 135, and small blind check calls. Then the turn is the 8 of clubs. He checks to me, and as planned, I check back to allow him to stab with a lot of those hands that I think he's floating the flop with. Could I value bet here? Yes, but I think it's a little bit thin, and I think allowing him to stab too often on the river is more beneficial than trying to get a little bit more value out of him by going really thin here. And also keep in mind how I said a lot of players fold too often on one specific straight post flop, and for this guy I really think it's the turn, so that also played a big role in the way I played this hand. I check back. The river is a 7 of diamonds. He checks, and then I end up checking back again. Now, why did I check back again here? It's honestly just because there are very few situations where I'm going to check back a flush draw on the turn, and because of that, my range ends up getting really capped here. And I also think that although this guy is a poor deep stack player, I think he's certainly capable of check shoving this river, especially if he has the ace of diamonds in his hand, and he can put me in an extremely difficult spot because my range is so capped. And because of that, I think that I can get enough value calls from him, but he might steal enough pots from me by turning a lot of his range into bluffs that I can't really value bet here. So that's why I end up checking back, and I find out that he has ace jack. I don't know if he had the ace of diamonds in his hand, and he ends up mucking. But the great thing about checking back the turn is I gave him an opportunity to bluff the river here. Hand number 5, this is pretty simple, but it's got one important concept that I wanted to go over with you guys. So folds me in the hijack, I open to 35, totally standard. Cutoff calls, button folds, and big blind calls. So we go 3-way to a flop of queen of clubs, 9 of clubs, 4 of hearts. Big blind checks to me, and I go ahead and c-bet here. And what I wanted to talk about is how I can construct my c-betting range in multi-way pots. So obviously I'm going to continue with all my big hands here. I'm firing with aces, kings, queens, 9s, 4s, queen 9, ace, queen, king, queen, and probably even queen jack here. So that's a lot of value in my range. Now what am I going to do with the bluffing part of my range? Well, obviously I take all the big equity hands and start with those. So hands like ace, king of clubs, ace, jack of clubs, the majority of my flush draws. I'm also going to have jack 10 in my range quite a bit, especially if it has a club in it. And then I like to add a little bit more air here with gut shots and that have one club in them. So if you're firing all your gut shots, I think you're over betting, or excuse me, over bluffing on this flop. But if you bet only the gut shots that have one club in them, that's probably a pretty balanced strategy. And the important thing to consider on flops like this is certain board runouts. So if a club comes off on the turn, that's great, I get to fire. But then if another club comes off, the majority of the time I'm usually going to have the nuts if I was semi bluffing, because I'm either semi bluffing with clubs or a gut shot with one club in them. So if it ends up going backdoor clubs, it's important to have just a few combinations of complete air in your range, and I think betting jack 10 here accomplishes that, because then you just have a couple combinations that don't have clubs in them, and it makes you a little bit more balanced on the rare occasions that the board runs out specifically like that. Then the other thing to consider is the difference between cutoff's range and big blind's range. So cutoff has mostly small pocket pairs and suited connectors, and I'm not really expecting him to continue with a lot of that. So he can have a hand like 10-9 suited or 9-8 suited, but other than that, he's not really continuing. So this allows me to play the hand in position quite a bit against the big blind. The big blind has more coverage on this board, so he has more queens in his range than the cutoff does. He also has a couple more nines and a couple more draws that are bigger than what the cutoff will usually have. And because of that, I'd like to get cutoff out of the way first here and start by betting so that I can set up a multi-straight bluff against big blind if the hand ends up playing out that way. Luckily for me, they both end up folding, and I don't have to worry about all of that. But there are a couple of important concepts that I wanted to go over on this specific board type. Hand number 6, this is something that a lot of live players screw up, but a lot of online players have pretty much figured out here as far as full ring goes. So EP1 opens, EP2 folds, and I'm EP3 with kings here. Now, in a really tough 5-10 lineup, 3-betting here is a mistake because you just have to have it. You have to have a hand like 10s plus, ace, king, ace, queen here. You have to have it, and you don't really have any bluffs in your range, because if you start bluffing here at all, at some point one of the 6 guys behind you is going to catch on to that and punish you. And also, each player left in this hand is going to be continuing at least 5% of the time against your 3-bet here. So you're going to run into big hands enough of the time that you can't really 3-bet with air here that often. So because of all of that, you should really take your whole range and flat with it here. So you could flat with like 7s through aces, and then you'd also take ace, king, ace, queen, and ace, jack if you think that that's playable, and you would just flat with all of that, and then those big hands in your range like aces and kings protect the rest of the weaker hands in your range. So that's kind of how you should play it. Now, this is totally different if you have whales behind you. So if the cutoff or the button is like a huge fish, you could 3-bet here and expect to get flatted by one of those guys just because they have no idea what they're doing. But under normal circumstances in a tough 5-10 lineup, flatting here is definitely the best play. So I flat, button calls, and we end up going 3-way to a flop here. So you're not always going to get squeezed and be able to get stacks in, and it's important that you know how to play this situation when it goes multi-way and maybe the hand plays out a little bit differently than you're used to. So the flop comes 9-7-3 and EP1 bets, and I think raising here on my part would be a mistake. I think I'm going to just run into too many hands either against the button or EP1, and I can still easily get stacks in against either of these guys just by calling here. So it gives me a little bit extra information from the button before we move on with the hand. So I call, button overcalls here, so it's kind of hard to figure out what he has here when he's overcalling with a stack like that. Does he have a hand like 10-8 suited or 6-8 suited, or maybe a pair like 7-6 that he just wants to see if he can turn something that he can continue with. It's really hard to figure out what he has here. It's kind of an odd play on his part. The turn is a jack of clubs and EP1 checks, and that's also really confusing. So I feel like he should be continuing with most of the range that he's betting the flop with here. So when he checks, I was a little bit confused and a little bit skeptical as to what he had. It almost made me feel like he turned top set or something. But at the same time, I have such a huge hand here, and I don't ever want the turn to check around. I feel like I'm just sacrificing too much value here. So I end up betting 300, and then button ships, and EP1 calls. Now, if EP1 had folded, I'm probably calling against button because it's only 300 more, and I'm getting decent odds. And occasionally, he's going to have something like Jack 10 where he had a gut shot in 2 overs and he peeled, or he's going to have something like 9-8 or 10-9 or 8-7 that he just feels like he should stick it in with and gamble. So I'm probably calling his shove, but then once EP1 overcalls, he basically turns his hand face up. Like, he has to have at least aces here. I don't even know if he would call with queens, and I think the majority of the time he has either top set or middle set. So basically the only way that I can be winning right here is if button shoved with a pair and a gut shot, and then EP1 ends up calling with a hand like queens, or just really does something really crazy and calls with ace jack. So even though I'm getting great odds to call and just peel for 430 and then pray that EP doesn't ship the river, I just don't think I'm really ever good here. I think I'm good like less than 5% of the time. So I end up making kind of a hero fold, but not really if you really think about the range of hands that I'm playing against. So I fold. River's a deuce of diamonds, and button tables his hand, and then EP1 shows up with something super crazy. He ends up turning the nuts and checking. So that was a really sick play on his part to check, induce me to value bet the worst hand, get button to shove, and then snap both of us off. And then, but if you go all the way back pre-flop, he's opening with 10-8 suited under the gun here. So that gives me even more incentive to be flatting with kings here and just allow him to kind of barrel off with all those crazy hands that he's opening way too wide with. And it also allows people behind me to try and squeeze me out of the pot. So that's kind of one of those situations where flatting kings is actually really beneficial to you. Hand number 7, so I get 3 limps ahead of me, and I'm in the cutoff with king jack. And although I'm not a big advocate of over limping, I really try and avoid that as much as possible. This is one of those situations where you're sacrificing a little bit of value by either raising big to like 75 or folding here. So I think raising to 75 is a little bit too wide, and I think you're going to get limp raised too often, especially in South Florida. And then also folding is kind of bad because you do still have a positional advantage against guys that are obviously pretty bad because they're limping pre. So I decide to just call here. This is one of the rare situations where you're going to see me limp pre. And we end up going 6 ways to a flop of Jack 10, 5, rainbow, small and big check. And then EP1 leads out. Now, this is a great spot where I have a lot of information on EP1. He's a huge whale, and he doesn't understand the difference between value betting and bluffing. So a lot of his range is depolarized here. He could even take a hand like Jack Deuce here or Ace 10 and lead out with it and overbet the pot just because he doesn't understand the difference between value betting and bluffing. So he leads out. Hijack ends up calling. Hijack is a competent player that I would assume is continuing with a reasonable range of hands. And I have King Jack, and I think King Jack is too high up in my range to fold here, especially against the EP1 and Hijack. And I don't really think small blind and big blind play a huge role in this hand. I think there's a decent chance that they would have let out if they had something. So I call, they both fold, and we go 3-way to the turn, which is the 3 of diamonds. EP1 bets again for 150. Hijack folds. Again, I think this hand is too high up in my range to fold yet. I would consider folding a hand like Jack 9, but I think King Jack is really just too strong in this spot, especially when I'm in position. I call again, and then the river is a 5. EP1 checks. This is a super easy value bet. Don't ever check back here. You should actually go pretty big and just expect to have the best hand almost 100% of the time here. So I bet 350. he calls, and he ends up tabling a counterfeited Jack 3 here. So this just reinforces what I was saying about the flop, where he just doesn't understand what his range should look like when he's leading out into that many people. And then, of course, he's also check calling my river bet here when he's almost never good. I'm not going to have a hand like 9-8 in my range here on the river. I would have raised him either on the flop or on the turn by now. So that's a really bad call on his part, really bad lead, and that's just kind of how you take advantage of people that are playing way too wide pre. Hand number 8. This is very similar to the other hand where I flatted kings against an early position raise, except now I'm playing against the guy that's flatting against an early position raise. So EP1 opens, EP2 flats, EP3 folds, then it gets to me in middle position and I have ace king. I think flatting here is a small mistake because it allows the rest of the guys behind you an opportunity to squeeze and make you play out of position when you don't have the initiative, and it also allows them to flat pretty liberally with suited connectors and small pocket pairs and make it difficult for you to play with a hand that's usually going to flop static equity. So ace king is often way ahead or way behind, and because of that it's easier to play if you're the aggressor. So I go ahead and 3-bet because it's just really easy to get those guys out of the way, and then it also allows me to figure out almost exactly what EP1 and EP2's ranges are. So overall, this is just way better. And then also notice the sizing. Again, I go a little bit bigger when I'm playing live cash games against players that don't understand how ranges should contort based on pot odds. So put all that together. That's why I did that. EP1 calls, he caps his range here. He can't have aces or kings. And then EP2 calls, he also can't have aces or kings. So both of their ranges are almost exactly sevens through queens and ace king and ace queen. It's so easy to play against a range like that because they have no idea what I have, and I know almost exactly what they have. So I flop Yahtzee. The flop comes queen 7 deuce with 3 diamonds, so I have huge equity against everything in their ranges. They check to me. Of course, I'm going to bet here when I flop this big. EP1 folds. Now keep in mind the range of hands that he's going to fold here, so he's probably folding ace king with no diamonds in it, and he's also probably folding small pocket pairs because EP2 is behind him. So there are some card removals effects when he folds here, and they have almost the exact same range. Then EP2 calls, so what's he calling with here? I think he's probably going to check raise queens and sevens here, and that's really just because he knows I have a lot of hands in my range that have big equity that he's probably going to get 200 big blinds from. So I think he's check raising all of those, and that kind of caps his range here. And keep in mind how difficult of a situation this is for him when he has a set, because if a diamond comes off, he might have to fold some really big equity on the turn to me when he has no idea what I have. So he's probably going to check raise with those just to make this hand easier for himself to play. So when he does that, he kind of caps his range here. He kind of only has ace queen, and he can't have the ace of diamonds in his range because I have it in my hand. And then the rest of his range is like jacks through eights. Hopefully he has a diamond in them, but can he really call a non-diamond turn with any of those? I don't think so. So the turn is the 8 of clubs, and this really only benefits 3 combinations of hands in his range, and it's just 8s. The rest of his range is jacks through 9s and ace queen with no diamond. So he checks, and like you've seen me do in other hands, I overbet ship the turn, and it's because ace king plays way better as a ship here than it does as a 3 street hand, because it's going to be hard for me to get any value if another diamond comes off on the river. And it's also going to be hard for me to get any value if an ace or a king comes off. So instead of making this a 3 street hand, it's just way better to turn it into a turn bomb and make it so that it's almost impossible for him to call with any part of his range here. I mean, he can try and hero call me with ace queen, but even then he knows that whatever I'm shoving the turn with here has huge equity against him. And even if he is ahead, there are plenty of times where he's going to be drawing completely dead, and because of that, I think I can get him to fold over 90% of the time here with a ship. So I ship and he folds, and this is how you win at Hold'em. You just find situations where people fold way too often, and you just hammer them over and over again until you build a stack. So that kind of wraps up the video. I really just wanted to show you guys what an average Saturday night looks like for me. I think the general theme of this video had a lot to do with 3-betting and fold equity and pot equity and understanding range versus range analysis. But really, the biggest thing for you to understand is that most live poker players are still stuck in 2003. So after the moneymaker boom, a ton of people started playing poker, and a lot of them liked to stack off over 200 big blinds with one pair on the flop. And all the guys that won the money back then were super nitty guys that relied on flopping sets a lot, okay? All the guys that still have money are those nitty guys, and they haven't changed since 2003. There are no fish left that like to stack off 200 big blinds with one pair. And because of that, you need to adapt your game. So everybody is still making really big mistakes. They're just making mistakes that are harder to see because most people don't understand fold equity. The way you beat all these nits is by continuously applying pressure and figuring out which street they're folding too often on, and then you attack that street during the hand. And you're never going to win somebody's whole stack unless you semi-bluff, run into a set, and get there. The times that you're going to win, it's because people are bleeding money to you by folding too often. They don't understand proper defense frequencies. That's how you win in 2015. So that kind of wraps up the video. I'm Hunter Sitchy from CheckShowPoker.com. Make sure you guys always run good, have fun, and constantly look for ways to improve.